The day my sister announced her engagement at my mother's kitchen table, she was wearing my grandmother's ring. Not a ring like my grandmother's. Not one she'd found at an antique shop that reminded her of it. The actual ring. The one my mother had promised me since I was 12 years old, sitting on the edge of Grandma Ruth's bed while she told me I had her stubborn streak and her cheekbones, and that someday this ring would belong to me. I stood in the kitchen doorway holding a casserole dish I'd brought over for Sunday dinner, and I watched my sister hold out her left hand across the table like she was presenting evidence. My mother gasped. My aunt cried. And my sister, my younger sister Heather, looked straight at me with a small, tight smile that said she knew exactly what she'd done. The man sitting next to her was Joel. We had dated for 2 years. I had introduced them at my own birthday party 11 months earlier. I set the casserole dish down on the counter without saying a word. Because what was there to say? The room was already filling up with congratulations. My aunt was already asking about venues, and Heather was already turned away from me, laughing at something Joel said, her hand still outstretched, that ring catching the light above the dinner table where our family had eaten together every Sunday for 30 years. I drove home alone that night and sat in my car in the parking lot of my apartment complex for a long time. Just sat there. The engine ticking as it cooled, the radio still on, some song I didn't recognize. I was 31 years old. I had a lease I couldn't afford to break, a job I liked but didn't love, and apparently a family that could reorganize itself around a betrayal without missing a beat. Let me back up. Joel and I had met at a work conference in Nashville. I was in healthcare administration, he was in pharmaceutical sales, and we'd ended up at the same hotel bar on a Wednesday night complaining about breakout sessions. He was funny, confident without being arrogant, or so I thought. We did long distance for 4 months before he relocated to Cincinnati, where I'd lived my whole life. The first year was good. Really good. The kind of good that makes you stop being careful, stop watching for the cracks, because you genuinely believe you found something solid. I brought him to my family's Sunday dinners. I introduced him to Heather. Heather was 27, 3 years younger than me, and she had always been the one people noticed first. Not because she was prettier. I don't say that to be self-deprecating. I say it because it's actually beside the point. But because she had this quality of making whoever she was talking to feel like the most interesting person in the room. She could do it with strangers. She could do it with anyone. She did it with Joel. I noticed them talking at my birthday party. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself Heather was just being Heather, warm and engaged and impossible not to like. I told myself I was being paranoid. 4 months later, Joel told me he needed space. He said it wasn't working. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking. He said he cared about me, but he couldn't give me what I deserved. All the language of someone who has already decided, already moved on, and is just completing the administrative task of ending things with you. I found out about Heather 6 weeks after that from my cousin, who assumed I already knew. I didn't confront either of them. I know that surprises people when I tell this story, but what was I going to accomplish? They'd already made their choice. Walking into that fire wasn't going to give me anything back. What I did instead was get very quiet and very focused in the way I always do when something has genuinely broken me. I went to work. I paid my bills. I started running again, something I'd let slide during the relationship. I called my 2 closest friends, Renata and Kim, and I told them what happened, and I let myself cry exactly once, for about 45 minutes, on Renata's couch, while she rubbed my back and didn't say anything useless. Then I got up and kept moving. My mother called me the week after the engagement dinner, and said she hoped I could find it in my heart to be happy for Heather. She said family was family. She said she knew this was complicated, but that she hoped I wouldn't let it become a bigger thing than it needed to be. I told her I loved her, and I got off the phone. I did not go to Sunday dinners for a while after that. I told myself it was temporary, that I just needed some distance, that eventually the jagged edges of this thing would smooth down enough that I could sit across a table from my sister and her fiancé and eat pot roast and make conversation like a functioning human being. I was still telling myself that when my dad had his first heart attack. He was 63. He'd been stubborn about checkups, about diet, about all the things men of his generation are stubborn about, and one morning in February, he was shoveling snow from the driveway and something in his chest just gave out. My mom found him. She called 911. She called me and Heather from the hospital waiting room, her voice so carefully controlled that it scared me more than screaming would have. He survived that one. But he was never quite the same after. The doctors adjusted his medications, told him to change his diet, told him no more heavy lifting, no more stress, as if you can just issue those instructions and have a person comply. My dad nodded and said yes and went home and proceeded to live his life mostly the way he always had, just slower. I started going to Sunday dinners again after that, because life is short and complicated and sometimes you choose the uncomfortable thing over the alternative. Joel was there most weeks. Heather would sometimes catch my eye across the table with an expression I could never quite decode. Apologetic maybe, or maybe just checking to see how I was doing, or maybe just making sure I wasn't going to cause a scene. I never caused a scene. I ate my dinner and talked to my dad about the Reds and helped my mom clear the table and drove home. That went on for about 8 months. Then my dad had the second heart attack and he didn't survive it. He died on a Tuesday morning in October. He was 64 years old. He had been planning to retire the following spring. He had a fishing trip booked with his brother for June that he'd been talking about since August. I flew back from a work trip when my mom called. I sat with her in the hospital for 3 hours before they let us see him. I held her hand in the waiting room, and I thought about all the ordinary Tuesday mornings I'd taken for granted, all the Sunday dinners I'd skipped, all the phone calls I'd kept short, because I was tired or busy or just assumed there would be more of them. The funeral was 4 days later. I wore a black dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion. I sat in the front pew with my mother and my aunt. Heather sat on my mother's other side with Joel next to her. At some point during the service, Heather reached across my mother and put her hand over mine, and I let her, because we were burying our father and some things are bigger than what people have done to you. It was afterward at the reception that everything unraveled. My mother's house was full of people, neighbors, colleagues of my dad's, extended family I hadn't seen in years. Someone had set up a folding table with cold cuts and casseroles. Someone else had brought enough flower arrangements to open a small shop. The whole thing had the particular chaos of grief. Everyone moving around each other, not quite sure where to put themselves. I was standing near the back window with a cup of coffee I wasn't drinking when I heard my aunt's voice, and then Heather's laugh. That specific laugh she has, a little too bright, a little too much for the situation. I turned around. Heather and Joel were standing with my aunt and a couple of her friends, and Heather was showing them her engagement ring, my grandmother's ring, and one of my aunt's friends was cooing over it, and my aunt was saying something about the wedding date. And Joel had his arm around Heather's shoulders with that easy confidence he'd always had, and Heather was smiling. At a reception. After our father's funeral. Showing off her engagement ring. I set down my cup of coffee and I walked over. Not because I had a plan, not because I knew what I was going to say. I just walked over and Heather saw me coming and something shifted in her expression. "Isn't it beautiful?" my aunt's friend said, still looking at the ring. "She's had it for months," my aunt said. "Your grandmother would have loved knowing it went to her." I looked at Heather. She looked back at me. Joel's arm was still around her shoulders. "It was actually promised to me," I said. My voice came out very calm. "Mom told me when I was 12. It was always supposed to be mine." The conversation went very quiet. Heather's smile didn't disappear exactly. It thinned. "Mom changed her mind," she said. "People are allowed to change their minds." "When?" I asked. "When did she change her mind? Before or after you started seeing Joel?" Joel cleared his throat. My aunt looked extremely uncomfortable. Her friends had gone very still in the way that people go still when they realize they've accidentally wandered into something real. Heather tilted her head. That look again, the one I could never decode. "Maybe this isn't the time," she said. "You're literally showing off your engagement ring at Dad's funeral reception," I said. "You brought the time with you." She pulled in a breath. I saw her make a calculation, the kind you make when you're deciding whether to back down or go further. She went further. "You know what your problem is?" she said, her voice dropping low so it didn't carry too far. "You've always made everything about yourself, even now, even today. You can't just let me have something." I almost laughed. I genuinely almost laughed because the architecture of what she just said was so perfectly inverted. She was wearing a ring that was supposed to be mine, engaged to a man I dated for 2 years, at our father's funeral reception. and I was the one who couldn't let her have something. "Okay," I said. I picked up my coffee cup. "Okay." I walked back to the window and I stood there for the rest of the reception, and I didn't cry, not once. And when the last guest left, I helped my mother wash dishes and then I drove home. I told myself I was fine. I told myself this for approximately 4 months, during which time I was very obviously not fine. I quit my job in February, not dramatically, not as a statement, just because a better opportunity came up at a hospital system in Columbus and I took it. Better title, better salary, real room to move up if I put in the work. I sublet my Cincinnati apartment and rented a place in Columbus sight unseen, based on a video walkthrough, which is not a thing I recommend because the video had been filmed with a wide-angle lens that made every room look twice as large as it actually was. But it was mine. No shared history. No Sunday dinners, no running into Joel at the grocery store. Just a small apartment in a city where nobody knew me. A job I was genuinely excited about, and approximately 11 months of rebuilding myself from scratch. I worked a lot that first year. I'm not going to dress it up as something more poetic than it was. I worked because work was something I could control, because it gave me forward momentum when everything else felt stalled. And because if I sat still too long, I started thinking about my dad, and that was the one thing I still couldn't do without falling apart. But I also started letting myself want things again, which sounds minor and isn't. I signed up for a half-marathon training program at a running club that met on Saturday mornings in Gooddale Park. I started cooking real meals instead of eating cereal over the sink. I went to a trivia night at a bar near my office with a few people from work and discovered I was genuinely funny in groups, which I'd somehow forgotten. It was at one of those trivia nights, a Tuesday in March, almost 2 years after I'd moved, that I met Patrick. He was on the opposing team. He'd gotten a sports question spectacularly wrong, and I'd made a comment that was funnier than I intended, and he'd laughed in the way that people laugh when something catches them off guard, and then he'd leaned over from his table to mine and said, "Okay, that was actually really good." Patrick was 34. He'd grown up in Pittsburgh, moved to Columbus for graduate school, stayed because he liked it. He ran a small environmental consulting firm with 2 partners, which he described on our first date as basically doing the thing that sounds boring, but is actually interesting if you explain it right. He was direct without being blunt. He asked good questions and actually listened to the answers. We dated for 14 months before he asked me to marry him. We were at home, our home by then. We'd moved in together after about a year, making pasta on a Sunday evening, and he just asked, no fanfare, no hidden cameras, no ring hidden in a dessert. He'd had the ring in his jacket pocket for 6 days, he told me later, trying to find the right moment. And eventually, he'd concluded that the right moment was just any moment when I was there. I said yes before he finished the sentence. We got married the following September in a small ceremony at an inn outside Columbus. 27 people, a dinner reception, a bluegrass band that played until the venue made a stop. It was the best day of my life, and I mean that without reservation. I called my mother to tell her about the engagement the same evening Patrick proposed. She cried, the happy kind. She said she was so glad I'd found someone. She said Patrick sounded wonderful. I also texted Heather, just a brief, factual text. I wanted you to hear it from me. Patrick and I got engaged tonight. She responded with a string of heart emojis and congratulations. So happy for you, with the double exclamation points she always uses. I put my phone down and went back to eating pasta with my fiancé, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, like I was standing on ground that was actually solid. What I hadn't known when I sent that text was that Heather and Joel's marriage had been deteriorating for almost a year. I found this out from my cousin in the same way I'd found out about their relationship in the first place, casually, as though it were common knowledge, as though surely I already knew. Apparently, Joel had developed a gambling problem that had been hidden for the first 2 years of their marriage and had then become very much not hidden. There had been debt. There had been lies about the debt. There had been a very bad 6 months during which Heather had been, by my cousin's account, barely holding it together. They separated in the spring. The divorce was finalized in July, 2 months before my wedding. I did not feel triumphant about this. I want to be honest about that because it would be easy to write the story like I felt vindicated, like I'd been waiting for it. I hadn't. I had stopped waiting for anything involving Heather and Joel a long time ago. What I felt was something closer to tired. Tired of the whole long story of it, my mother asked if I would invite Heather to the wedding. I thought about it for a long time. A genuine, serious think, not the kind where you already know the answer and are just pretending to deliberate. I thought about my grandmother's ring on Heather's hand at Dad's funeral. I thought about you've always made everything about yourself. I thought about her laugh, too bright, while my father's friends stood around a folding table eating cold cuts. I also thought about her hand of remind during the service, about the way she'd cried at the graveside, really cried, shoulders shaking, and how I'd put my arm around her without deciding to. I invited her. She came alone. She was quieter than I'd ever seen her. Not subdued, not sad exactly, just careful in a way she hadn't been before. She wore a blue dress and sat near the back during the ceremony and cried again during our vows, the same shaking shoulder cry as the graveside. At the reception, she found me between dinner and dancing, and she stood in front of me for a moment without saying anything. Then she said, "He's really good, your Patrick. He looked at you the whole time during the ceremony. Joel never looked at me like that." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am." I looked at my sister, this person I'd known my entire life, who had done something that had genuinely broken something between us, who was standing in front of me in a blue dress at my wedding, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her look. "I know," I said. That was all. We didn't hug. We didn't have some long, cathartic conversation. She went back to her seat, and I went back to my husband, and the band started playing, and we danced until the venue made us stop. 3 months later, Heather called me. She'd been offered a job in Seattle. A good one. Marketing director at a tech company. A real step up. She was thinking about taking it. She wanted to know what I thought. I told her I thought she should take it. "Really?" she said. "Really," I said. "You should go somewhere new. Start over. It helps." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How did you do it? After everything? How did you just keep going?" I thought about the parking lot outside my old apartment, the engine ticking, the radio playing a song I didn't know. I thought about Renata's couch and 45 minutes of crying and then getting up. I thought about 11 months in Columbus, working late, running on Saturday mornings, discovering I was funny in groups. I just kept going, I said. That's the whole secret. There isn't another one. She took the job. She moved to Seattle in January. We text occasionally. Not often, not the way sisters are supposed to, but occasionally. Real texts, not just heart emojis. Progress, I think, in the direction of something. Patrick and I bought a house last spring, a real house, with a yard and a porch and a kitchen large enough to actually cook in. We hosted Thanksgiving for the first time, and my mother came, and my aunt, and some friends, and we ate too much and stayed at the table for 2 hours after the food was gone, just talking. My dad would have loved Patrick. I know this the same way I know a lot of things about my dad now, with a certainty that arrived after he was gone, when there was no longer any noise in the way. He would have liked Patrick's directness, his particular kind of humor, the way he argues about sports with a real conviction, even though he's usually wrong. They would have talked for hours. I keep a photo of my dad on the bookshelf in our living room. He's laughing at something off camera, caught mid-sentence, the way the best photos always are. I walk past it every morning on my way to the kitchen. Some mornings I still have to stop and breathe through it. Most mornings now I just say good morning in my head and keep walking. My grandmother's ring is still on Heather's finger, as far as I know. She kept it after the divorce. It was a gift, legally hers. I stopped thinking about it somewhere in the middle of that first Columbus winter, and I haven't thought about it much since. Patrick proposed with a ring he'd picked out himself, from an estate jewelry shop in the Short North neighborhood. A simple oval sapphire. Nothing like what I would have chosen if someone had asked me, which is exactly why I love it. He knows me well enough to know what I don't know about myself yet. Some days I think about the version of my life that might have been the one where Joel and I stayed together, where I kept going to Sunday dinners and waiting for something to shift, where I stayed in Cincinnati in that apartment with the parking lot I'd learned to think of as my crying spot. I think about it and I feel nothing but relief. Not because that life would have been bad necessarily, but because it was never really mine. This one is. Every difficult, redirected, hard-won piece of it. That's the thing nobody tells you about losing something. Sometimes what you're losing is just the road that was taking you the wrong way. Sometimes the betrayal is the detour. Sometimes the parking lot in the dark is just the pause before you start the engine again and drive somewhere you actually want to be. I'm there now. It took longer than I thought it should, and it cost more than I wanted to pay, and there are still mornings when I walk past my dad's photo and have to breathe through it. But I'm there. I used to think the worst thing that could happen to a person was losing something they loved. I know better now. The worst thing is staying so focused on what was taken from you that you never notice what you're building in its place. Heather took Joel. She took my grandmother's ring. She took 2 years of Sunday dinners that should have been uncomplicated and turned them into something I had to brace myself to survive. I'm not going to pretend those things didn't cost me. They did. There were nights in that Columbus apartment, the one that was smaller than the video made it look, when the cost felt like more than I'd agreed to pay. But here's what I've come to understand about the way consequences actually work. They're not instant, and they're not dramatic, and they don't arrive with music. Joel's gambling debts didn't appear because the universe decided Heather deserved punishment. They appeared because Joel was always the kind of person who hid things, and Heather had chosen to love someone she didn't actually know, and that choice had a weight to it that eventually had to land somewhere. I couldn't have engineered that outcome. I couldn't have predicted it. All I could do was make sure I wasn't still standing in the same place when it arrived. That's the thing I keep coming back to. The choice that actually saved me wasn't leaving Joel, or moving to Columbus, or even meeting Patrick. It was the choice I made on Renata's couch after 45 minutes of crying, the choice to get up. That's it. That's the whole architecture of whatever I've managed to build. Just the decision, made over and over again, to keep moving in the direction of something real, what I had to learn. And it took longer than I want to admit was the difference between being strong and being rigid. I thought for a long time that holding myself together meant not letting anything in, not grief, not anger, not the particular loneliness of being the person at the family dinner table who everyone is carefully not talking about. I was disciplined about my pain in the way you're disciplined about a wound you don't want to look at directly. Real steadiness, I found out, is different. It's not about refusing to feel things. It's about feeling them clearly enough that you can make honest decisions anyway. It's about knowing the difference between the story you're telling yourself and the situation you're actually in. When I finally looked straight at what Heather had done, not the version I'd softened to make it bearable, but the actual thing, I was able to make a clear-eyed choice about what I wanted my life to look like going forward. That clarity was the thing that moved me, and the integrity piece. I think about this too. I didn't expose them. I didn't weaponize what I knew. I didn't make my mother choose or poison the family against them, even when I had standing to do all of those things. Not because I was above it, but because I understood, somewhere beneath the hurt, that how I behaved in that period was going to determine who I was on the other side of it. I wanted to be someone I recognized when it was over. Patrick sees that person. That's why I knew, on a Sunday evening making pasta, exactly what my answer was before he finished asking. I walked through a hard few years and I came out carrying something I couldn't have found any other way. A clear sense of my own worth, a marriage built on honesty, a life that belongs to me, not despite what happened, because of how I chose to respond to it. That's the only revenge that ever actually works.